He came in unconscious and left without a face, without a uniform, without a name. But his real name, that one, only I knew, and I swore I'd carry it with me to the end. Some people think war is just bullets, maps, and generals. But the real war hides in the corners nobody pays attention to, in the muffled sobs of a man who learned to swallow fear, in the stare that crosses a minefield not with hatred, but with doubt, and sometimes in the silent touch between two bodies that, by convention, were supposed to hate each other. It's strange how the world teaches us to choose sides, as if the heart had borders, as if love could wear blue or red, right or wrong. But in that field tent, between morphine and blood, I learned that the purest kind of love is also the most dangerous, because it demands that you let go of everything you were told was true. This isn't just a war story. It's an emotional story about a nurse who dared to see humanity where she was taught to see an enemy. A story about a secret that wasn't written in documents or stamped in records, but stitched, thread by thread, into the silence between two strangers. And if you stay here with me, maybe, just maybe, I'll be able to show you that the cruelest thing about war isn't always death. My name is Naomi Joelle Franklin. I'm 85 now. Time has shaped me like this. Dark skin with the texture of stories, eyes that have seen what they shouldn't, and hands that still tremble when the wind blows from the east. I live in a modest home in the heart of Mississippi, where the silence is as thick as the mud that holds up the walls of my living room. There, hanging in metal frames, are the faces war took without asking permission. Some I called patience. One I called quietly, only in my mind, my love. I served as a field nurse during the Korean War. I was there during the Hungnam evacuation, a name not many know, but one I carry in my chest like an invisible scar. My head is shaved close, as it has been since that winter. I wear hand-embroidered tunics and beaded necklaces my grandmother swore kept evil away. But no necklace ever protected me from him, or from myself. Some secrets we keep out of fear, others out of shame. Mine, out of love. And today, with this lamp lit beside me, I want to open this door like I'm opening my chest, slowly, carefully, and with tenderness. Come, sit here with me. Take a deep breath. Let the kettle whistle. Let time run free out there. And listen with your heart. Because this war story I'm about to tell you never had space on the battlefield. But maybe, just maybe, it'll find a place in your soul. And if anything here touches you, if anything here reminds you that love can bloom even in the middle of horror, subscribe to this channel, like the video. Not for me, but for all of us who once loved in silence and survived. People think snow doesn't have a smell, but it does. It really does. Anyone who's lived through a war in the cold knows exactly what I mean. In Hungnam, snow smelled like iron, smoke, and absence. It was as if the sky had spit frozen silence onto the earth, and all we could do was swallow hard and keep moving. Every step I took across the evacuation field, my foot sank into something that looked like cotton, but hurt like thorns. There was blood mixed into that snow, blood and despair. And I remember thinking, for the very first time, that the whole world could collapse right there, and no one would even notice. It was December of 1950. And the wind cut like a blade. I was just another nurse among hundreds, trying to stitch life together where only scraps were left. But that morning, a presence called out to me. Not with words, but with something deeper. It was him, slumped off a makeshift stretcher, barely breathing, face covered in soot, and eyes half shut. A soldier with no insignia, no name, and no knowledge of our language. Just that wounded body, and a breath that seemed to whisper, "Don't forget me." I was supposed to follow protocol. Write it down, catalog, inject, move on. But something inside me trembled in a different way, as if that broken body wasn't a stranger, as if fate had blown him straight to my cot. And even though I didn't know a single thing about him, not his country, not his rank, not his story, I felt it. I felt that man wasn't just another number among the wounded. He was a secret waiting to be born. That first night, I slept beside him. Yes, I did. On the hard tent floor, my apron as a blanket, and my chest aching from the inside. Because even though I told myself it was just compassion, something in me was already slipping out of control. The war had taught me how to bury feelings. But with him, they started blooming right in the middle of the mud. And it all began with that smell, the smell of snow, of cold that pulls bodies close, of fear that brings even enemies together. He barely moved, but when he opened his eyes for the first time, I swear I saw a whole universe collapse inside them. There was no rage, no threat, just hunger, but not for food. Hunger of the soul, of relief, of someone who wouldn't see him as a mistake to be erased. And right then, before I even knew his real name, which I wouldn't find out until much later, I made the most dangerous choice of my life. I saw humanity where I had been trained to see evil. The sound of bombs in the distance felt like it came from another world. The war roared outside, but inside that tent, time stretched and slowed. He moaned softly sometimes. Other times he just looked at me, or pretended not to. And I cared for him like someone hiding a flower beneath the rubble. I couldn't let anyone find out. He wasn't one of ours. He was one of theirs. But my soul had already crossed a line even I didn't fully understand. And that's how it all began. With a nameless man in a land trying to swallow us whole. With an emotional story buried in the dirty snow of the Hungnam evacuation. And with a nurse who, without meaning to, started loving something they had promised was unlovable. But it was only later, much later, that I learned his real name. And that's when everything changed. His uniform didn't say a thing. No color, no flag, no stitching to give away his side. Just his eyes. And eyes, darling. Eyes tell what the fabric tries to hide. They were brown, but not cold. They didn't carry the weight of men who'd killed out of conviction. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen too much, too soon. Eyes of a boy who had to grow up running from explosions. Eyes that, when they met mine, were begging for comfort, without ever saying a word. Back then I'd seen more than enough. Thick blood dripping through fingers, bodies stiffening in silence. Screams so sharp they became part of the air, like a buzzing that never left. But with him, there was a different kind of absence. Not the absence of speech, but the absence of defense. He didn't even shield himself with his gaze. And that completely disarmed me. You learn in war to keep your distance, to separate who's an ally and who's a threat. But no one teaches you what to do when the threat quietly cries in his sleep, or when he trembles at the sound of thunder, like his body's still trying to run. He didn't understand a word I said. And to be honest, he didn't have to. Care has its own language. When I changed the bandage on his shoulder, he looked at me like he'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched without pain. And that's when I understood. The enemy had the eyes of a boy. He had a crooked scar near his collarbone, barely closed, from before he got to me. Every time I cleaned that wound, it felt like I was touching a past that wasn't mine. And still, it felt like I had a duty to rewrite it. with gauze and silence. There was one day, I remember clearly, when he smiled. It was faint, shy, like he was apologizing for still having joy left in his chest. And that smile hurt more than any groan, because smiling in those conditions was an act of resistance, and love in that kind of setting was a deadly risk. I started hiding little things for him. A piece of apple someone left behind in the mess hall, an extra blanket rolled up in the corner of the tent, a word whispered under my breath, even if he didn't understand. I talked, just so he'd know someone there cared, and every now and then he'd answer with his eyes, like he was saying, "I know, even if I don't understand the words." Those eyes, deep brown, marked, followed me even when I washed my hands in silence. When the soap ran red down my fingers, I'd think, how many of these boys disappeared without ever being seen as human? And why, out of all of them, did this one get stuck in my chest? Some of the other nurses started to notice my mood shift. I got quieter, more precise. No one suspected the reason, but I knew I was crossing an invisible line, and every time I walked back to his cot, it felt like stepping over a border with no map. I was caring for someone the system had labeled the enemy. But my heart said something else. It said there was a secret there. One of those that never makes it into the reports. One of those that changes everything, without making a sound. And in that pale face, in the boy's eyes hidden inside an unconscious soldier, something was born that I no longer had space to hold. It was a quiet kind of affection, like a stubborn flower growing through rubble. And even without a name, without certainty, without a future, he started to live inside me. But it was in the middle of the night, when the rain was pounding hard on the canvas roof, that he grabbed my wrist for the first time. And in that trembling touch, I realized that love had already crossed the trench. War documents are cold, files, reports, medical charts, all neatly organized as if human pain could be cataloged into boxes and stamps. But what no one tells you is that between the lines of those official papers lives silence. The silence of names never spoken, of faces no one bothered to record, of lives that didn't fit inside the identification field. Back then, every patient who came to us got a number, a code, sometimes a set of initials, and then oblivion. I got used to it far too quickly. You learn to follow rules when the world is crumbling around you. But when he arrived, that man with no uniform, no country, no language, protocol started to feel heavy. Because the more time passed, the more I knew that wounded body carried something no form could ever explain. The officers only wanted to know if he had a chance of surviving, if he was worth the effort. If not useful, he'd be discarded, sent to a POW camp or worse. But I saw a name hiding in the lines of his face. I saw a story no report cared to hear. Because he wasn't just some unidentified subject. He was someone, and I wanted to know who. I started watching him closely. The way he'd close his eyes every time I dabbed saline on the gauze. The faint murmurs in his sleep, like he was calling someone. The half-healed scars on his ankle, the clean fingernails even in the middle of the mud. Everything about him spoke of origin, of a home, of a name that didn't fit on any official line. One of those long nights, while the other nurses were asleep and the rain kept tapping on our makeshift roof, I heard it. He whispered a word, softly, like a sigh, like he was trying to remind himself who he was. Ji-hoon. He said it more than once, low, painful, as if afraid even his name might be ripped away. I wrote it down on a scrap of paper, folded it and tucked it into my beaded necklace. And there it stayed, a name nobody else knew, a name that couldn't officially exist. Because in that world, giving a name to the enemy meant giving a face, a soul. And war didn't want that. War wanted anonymity to justify the cruelty. But I refused. I pretended I didn't know. On the paperwork, he stayed Patient N27. But inside me, he had already become someone again. Ji-hoon. A name I couldn't say out loud. A secret living between my heartbeat and the forms I pretended to fill out without feeling. And every time I wrote N27 on those sheets, it felt like I was lying. Like I was erasing something sacred. In war, what isn't named isn't remembered. And what isn't remembered disappears. I couldn't let him disappear. It was just one word, but inside it lived everything. His childhood, the family he might never see again, the stories he couldn't tell, the homeland that condemned him, and in some strange way, the part of me that got lost when I fell for someone the world insisted didn't exist. And there, in that crumpled sheet of paper, the secret started to take form. His real name, kept between a silent prayer and a bureaucratic lie. And as strange as it sounds, I fell in love with that name before I fully loved the man. Because to name something is to give it life. And giving life in a place like that was the boldest act of rebellion I could commit. The first lie never really feels like a lie. It comes gently, wrapped in silence, tasting more like care than guilt. I said he had a fever, even though I knew he didn't, just to keep him under my care, just to stop them from transferring him. That small medical invention hurt me more than any wound I ever treated during the war, because that was the moment I realized I was crossing a line I could never come back from. For love. Before the war, lying was something I avoided with everything in me. Mama used to say lying was like driving a nail into wood. Even if you pulled it out, the hole would still be there. But in that cold tent, surrounded by bodies and the sound of helicopters overhead, the truth felt like a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Ji-hoon, yes, I was already calling him that in my head, was a secret within a secret. And to keep him close, near me, I had to learn how to bend reality like you fold damp sheets, with steadiness, but shaking inside. The first lie was medical. The second, emotional. When they asked if he'd shown any signs of aggression, I shook my head firmly, but my stomach turned to ice. He'd grabbed my wrist the day before. It wasn't violent. It was desperate. But if I told them, they'd see it as a threat, and I couldn't let them judge him for a fear he could barely keep hidden. I knew that fear. I had felt it myself years before, when I was denied a job because of the color of my skin. It was the same fear of being seen as something you're not. So I lied, and I kept lying, with every poorly phrased question, with every form I filled out that read, "No complications." I sealed my silent pact with a man the world was trying to erase. Me, a nurse. Him, the enemy. But in there, between one dressing change and the next, we were just two human beings trying to stay alive, in completely different ways. I even started hiding things from him. I didn't tell him when patrols came close. I didn't mention how they were starting to question my behavior. And when he looked at me with those eyes that already knew me inside out, I smiled, as if everything was fine, as if all of it was normal, as if I were still the professional I was trained to be. But I wasn't. I was someone else. I was a woman, a body alive in front of another body, a soul trying to save what the world wanted to wipe away. The lie didn't feel heavy at first. It was light, like a feather. But repeating it over and over became part of me. I no longer knew where duty ended and feeling began. I didn't know if I was caring for him out of vocation or out of an attachment growing like roots beneath the snow. All I knew was, every time I lied, I was protecting him from the system, protecting myself from the madness of losing him. And the worst part? I knew that sooner or later someone would find out. Another nurse watching from a distance, a paper left out on the table, a name whispered when I thought no one could hear. But even so, I kept going. Because in war, we choose the lies we can live with. And I chose this one, not with pride, but with love. With a love that didn't fit inside anyone else's version of truth. Maybe that's when things truly began to fall apart, because love that has to hide always finds a way to spill out, in a glance, in the tremble of a hand, in the silence that lasts just a little too long. And one of those lies, one in particular, was going to cost me more than I could ever imagine. The body has its own language. It speaks even when the mouth stays shut, even when fear demands silence. And the day my skin touched his, not with the gloves of duty, but with the surrender of humanity, I knew nothing would be safe anymore. Until then, everything between us was filtered through cotton, tweezers, bandages. It was a technical touch, professional, necessary. But I knew the difference. I knew the exact moment a gesture stops being protocol and becomes a choice. That day the hot water had run out, and my hands were too cold to treat such an exposed wound. I hesitated, and he, eyes lowered, gently grabbed my wrist. For the first time, not out of fear, but with care. A care that unraveled me from the inside. His skin was warm, alive, even though it carried the heat of fever and the weight of exhaustion. And in that suspended second between duty and desire, my whole body screamed in silence, because that touch, that simple contact between two tired pulses, was forbidden. It was unthinkable. It was insubordinate. But it was also real. Real in a way no rule could contain. In that moment, I felt myself transported far from the war. It was as if the sirens, the smell of gunpowder, and the cries all around had vanished for a few heartbeats. I wasn't a nurse anymore. He wasn't the enemy. We were just two survivors brushing up against each other's edges, trying to remember that something existed beyond the pain. But a gesture like that doesn't stay hidden for long. My heart pounded too hard afterward. Every time I crossed paths with another team member's glance, I was sure they'd seen it, that they'd noticed, that the guilt was written all over my face. But no one said anything, because in that war, everyone was hiding something. And my secret had a name, a scent, and a skin my memory would never forget. I spent the rest of that day in silence. I avoided going back to him. Told myself it was just a moment, that it didn't mean anything. But at night, when I went to adjust his blanket, our hands touched again, quick, subtle, like the universe had opened a crack in time just to let it happen. And right then I realized, love born in war doesn't ask for permission. It seeps in, it resists, it burns without showing itself. Even now, when I close my eyes, I remember that touch. Not as something erotic. It wasn't that. It was deeper. It was like he was saying, without saying, I see you. And after so long being invisible, just another black woman in a white coat, doing her job among men who never asked my name. That shattered me, because he saw me, and I saw him. That touch wasn't supposed to happen. Not there. Not between us. But it did. And from that moment on, the love that had only hinted between the lines began to take real shape. Shape of danger. Shape of faith. Shape of a secret. And like any secret, it started to demand its price. A price that sooner or later would come with interest. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about that. I just wanted to feel his skin again. Because for the first time in that war, I didn't feel alone. Inside the medical tent between vials of penicillin and the hum of pain, there was a small cardboard box where I kept scraps of silence. They weren't medicine. They were letters. Letters I wrote in those frozen midnight hours when sleep refused to come and the war seemed to pause for just a moment. I wrote them to him. Not to the prisoner name they'd assigned. Not to Patient N27. I wrote to Ji-hoon. To the man breathing in the cot beside me, with fever in his eyes and a secret in his chest. Letters I never signed, never gave him, and that could never be sent. The first ones were short, almost shy. Today you opened your eyes for 12 seconds. Your pulse feels stronger. I hope the pain eases tomorrow. But soon they started to change. I started to write about myself, about the wooden house in Mississippi, about the smell of the wood-burning stove from my childhood, about the feeling of walking barefoot on wet earth after the rain. I told him about my father, who sang softly while picking cotton, and about my mother, who said the only thing war could never take from us was our capacity to love. Writing was how I breathed. On those folded sheets hidden inside that box, I could be whole. I could fully feel what I wasn't allowed to feel, out loud. Sometimes I wrote as if he could read English. Other times as if just the sound of my pen moving across paper would be enough to say everything. The words poured out of me with a force even gunfire couldn't silence. Because hidden love does that. It screams on paper when it can't speak from the lips. I kept over 20 letters through the weeks. Some were stained with blood. Mine or his, I'll never know. Others were scrawled hastily between shift changes and bombings. In one of them I confessed, "I don't know your real name, but I swear my name sounds different in my own head when I think of you." Another one read, "If the world were another place, I'd ask you to dance, slowly, in the middle of the night, with no music, just so I could hear your breath on my neck." I never had the courage to show them, not out of fear of punishment, but because those letters were mine. They were pieces of my affection that couldn't exist outside the page. It felt safer to let them live, folded in silence. As if hiding them was the only way to love him, with dignity, in a world that called that kind of love betrayal. He never knew about the letters. Never saw one. Or if he did, he pretended not to. Maybe he felt it in my tired eyes or in the way I straightened his blanket that I was holding too much inside. But war doesn't leave time for confessions. It demands an urgency, pragmatism, protocol. And the letters, well, the letters were the opposite of that. They were forbidden tenderness in a time of brutality. Even now, some of them still exist. They're here with me, yellowed with time, folded with the same care I used to touch him. Sometimes I read them again. Sometimes I just rest my cheek on the paper and cry softly. Because in that forgotten box tucked between books and old photographs lives the only version of the war story that truly belonged to me, the one no one ever acknowledged, the one I lived in the space between his pain and mine, the one that existed between who I was and who I almost allowed myself to become. The cold that night was brutal. Not even the watery coffee or makeshift blankets could fight off the chill rolling down from the mountains. The wind slipped through the cracks in the canvas like it was hunting for something to freeze from the inside out. And yet, somehow, that same night, I felt warm, not in my body, but in a place much harder to reach, my soul. He'd woken up drenched in sweat, his breath ragged, eyes lost somewhere far away. I sat beside him without a word. I took his hand, like I always did, even knowing I shouldn't, and waited for the fear to pass. He looked at me like he wasn't in the war anymore. Like just for a second, he was just a man waking from a bad dream. And that's when he said it. Softly, shaky, almost too faint to hear. Home! At first, I thought he was delirious. Maybe dreaming of his house, his family, his country. But no. His eyes told me something else entirely. He meant me. He was saying it to me. Like he'd found peace in the middle of chaos. Like even without a flag or a place to belong, he'd found shelter in another human being. And in that one word, simple, whispered into the dark, I finally understood the depth of what existed between us. I've been called a lot of things in my life. Nurse, sister, caregiver, invisible. But never home. Never someone a person wanted to stay with. Never the place where a man might lay down what was left of himself. And there, in that cold, damp tent, with boots stomping and wounded men moaning all around, I became the home of someone war wanted to erase. That word echoed in me for days. Home. It wasn't perfect English, but it was perfect enough. It held the one thing no battlefield could ever name. Connection. That man, without uniform, without visible country, without a ring on his hand, gave me the greatest bond of all. He called me his refuge, and that meant more to me than any kiss ever could. From that night on, something shifted. The way he looked at me, the way he waited for me before I even arrived, the way he seemed to breathe easier when I was near. And in me, I started noticing how the loneliness faded when he was there. Like, despite it all, I had found my home, too. But war doesn't allow homes. It exists to destroy them. And I knew that moment, that breath, was just a pause before the next storm. Still, it was mine. It was ours. A small patch of stillness in the middle of chaos, where two souls could recognize each other, even with entire worlds between them. I held on to that word like a keepsake. Home. Such a small word for something so vast. And every time he drifted off to sleep after that, I'd wonder, is it possible to be home for someone the world wants to exile? Is it right to offer shelter when everything around you demands rejection? I didn't have the answers. But that night, I knew one thing for sure. There was something between us that couldn't be undone. Something stronger than war, truer than any speech, purer than any official document. And even if no one ever believed it, I was someone's home. Even if only for a moment, even if it was just inside a tent. The patrol came at the same time every day. Rhythmic footsteps, boots crusted with snow, eyes trained to spot mistakes. They called it protocol, security, vigilance, order. But to me, it was a threat, a constant reminder that my love, even in silence, was a crime, and that every gesture I made could turn into a sentence. I started anticipating them, learned the sounds that came before their visits, the subtle scrape of crates, the shuffle of changing shifts, the flap of canvas snapping in the wind. When the weather shifted, they came earlier. I had to stay a step ahead. I had to keep Ji-hoon quiet enough to seem unimportant, but alive enough to stay there. A cruel balance between neglect and protection. I began to alter his charts, just enough to avoid raising flags. I'd reduce how often I mentioned him in reports, omit reactions, blur improvements. When asked, I'd say he was sedated, barely responsive, didn't react to stimuli. And he helped me, without even knowing. He stayed quiet, still, obedient. Like he understood his very existence was a secret I carried in every bone of my body. I had to keep the curious at bay. Nurses who wanted to help. Soldiers who passed by and asked too many questions. With them, I hardened my face. Slipped into the role of the efficient, sharp, practical nurse. That was my disguise. Because inside, every time I heard the patrol's boots, my heart beat like a war drum. And that heart, that was what I hid most. Not in files or apron pockets, but behind my gaze. A gaze trained to look empty, but burning as if it already knew this couldn't last. During one inspection, a sergeant walked straight into our ward. He looked around, pointed, asked about these unidentified. When he stepped toward Ji-hoon's bed, I froze. He was awake, eyes open, alert. I felt the blood drain from my face. But Ji-hoon, he pretended, so well. Turned his head, closed his eyes, breathed slow, like he was still doped up. A man acting inside his own pain. And I, standing beside him, calm, jotting down something on an imaginary chart, as if I hadn't even noticed the visitor. The patrol left. They found nothing, saw nothing. And still, that night, I cried. Not out of fear. I was used to that. I cried because I saw how far I had gone, because I realized what I had become to protect a feeling no one else was allowed to see. I had become an accomplice to my own heart, and more, my identity as a nurse, the one who saves, who heals, who mends, was blurring with the woman who loved in secret, who protected a man like she was guarding the last flicker of humanity in a world smothered by ash. In war, hiding the wounded was part of the job. But hiding love, no one teaches you that. And love born in silence needs strategy, needs courage, needs roots, signs, distractions. I started using codes with him. A flick of my hand meant danger. A soft squeeze on his shoulder meant it was safe. And every time our eyes met in those moments, I felt we were tied together by something invisible, as if our bodies understood each other beyond language, beyond touch. And still it only took one misstep, one wrong word, one movement too bold, and everything would fall apart. But what I didn't know back then was that it wasn't just the patrol, Ho-jan. There was someone else, someone who had started to suspect, and that someone had the power to tear us apart forever. There are moments when war seems to shrink. It's still there, loud, tearing pieces from the world. But suddenly, it's no longer the center of everything. It was on a pale-skied afternoon, with red mud still sliding beneath our boots, and the ambulances creaking like ghosts, that I realized my world no longer revolved around sirens. It revolved around one gaze, his. Ji-hoon could sit up by then. He didn't speak much, but his eyes did. He didn't pretend as much anymore, not with me. And I had stopped pretending with myself too. I loved him, not in the way that clings or possesses, but in the way one finds shelter in the middle of ruin. That feeling grew quietly, like wild grass between stones, asking for no permission, waiting for no approval. It simply existed, even when reason screamed that it was madness. It was hard to explain, even to myself. Around him, the sounds of war felt muffled. The sting of gunpowder didn't burn so deep in my nose. The northern morning cold didn't cut as sharp. When I was with him, even the scars on my hands seemed to ache less. There was something in the way he looked at me. Gentle, yes, but also knowing. Like he was saying, I see who you are, even if you've forgotten. One of those afternoons, while the others slept from exhaustion, I sat on the floor beside his cot. He didn't say a word, just placed his hand gently over mine. And we stayed there. No music, no talk, just presence. That thick, living kind of presence that reminds you, even in a land soaked in death, love still knows how to bloom. I remember the sound of water dripping from a leaky bucket, the creak of metal beneath his body's weight, the thunder of my own heartbeat, loud enough to betray us. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Not there. Not in that little bubble of peace we made in the middle of chaos. Because in that moment, war felt smaller. Not less violent, not less cruel, but smaller than what I felt. It's hard to explain how something so wrong in the world's eyes can feel so right inside. It's like we're taught our whole lives to fear love that doesn't follow rules. But there, in the mud and blood, that love was the only thing still clean, the only thing untouched by hate. Loving Ji-hoon wasn't rebellion. It was sanity. It was raw, unfiltered humanity. And that day, I learned something I've never forgotten. War tries to take everything, but it can't erase what's felt in the dark. And when a feeling is strong enough, no general's boots, no reports, no ideological walls can hold it back. The feeling seeps through. It spills. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to touch it, it becomes shelter. But the world doesn't like when we find shelter in the wrong places. And the world was about to push back. Not every day does a nurse make a promise with a needle in hand. But that morning, when I noticed the gash on his side reopening, I knew. It wasn't just a wound. It was a warning. His body was telling us it couldn't take much more. And there I was, with trembling fingers and an empty stomach, stitching it closed like someone sealing a vow, with thread, skin, and feeling. Stitches in that place were always rushed. There were more bodies than there were hands. But that day, I asked to be alone with him, said I needed focus. That was true, but not the whole truth. I needed quiet. I needed him to know, somehow, that what I was about to do was more than medical. It was a vow no one else would hear, but one that would mark him. And me. I cleaned the wound gently, like I had done so many times before. But something in the way my hands moved told me this might be the last. Maybe he was being transferred. Maybe someone had started to notice. Or maybe he was simply slipping away. My heart held that feeling like someone cradling a sick bird in their chest. It still breathed, but you knew it wouldn't be for long. With every stitch, I whispered something. Not out loud, but inside. It was like a crooked prayer, not tied to any religion, but full of faith. Stay a little longer. Come back when it's safe. Remind me this was real. And with every pull of the thread, the sound of it slicing through flesh mixed with the crackling inside my own chest. Not from physical pain, but from the certainty that time was running out. He looked at me, said nothing, but his eyes knew. They knew I was leaving more than a scar on his body. I was leaving a promise of silence, a promise of memory, a promise of love, even if no one else ever knew, even if the whole world forgot. When I finished, I allowed myself a small gesture. I touched his forehead with the back of my hand, quick, almost maternal, almost, and he closed his eyes. Not in pain, but like someone who accepts, who understands, who, without speaking, replies, "Me too." I laid the cloth gently over the stitches. They were neat, clean, deep, and I knew they'd heal. But the wound inside me, I didn't know how to close that one, because the promise I made in that moment couldn't be undone. It was written into him, and somehow into me too, as if, by stitching his skin, I'd stitched my soul to a story that would never be printed in history books. An emotional story built from silence, defiance, and a love that bloomed in the cracks of war. And every time I think of that last stitch, I feel like I left something there I never got back. A piece of my courage, a piece of my hope, a piece of the woman I was before all of this. Because making a promise in the middle of war is a risk even greater than loving. But I made it, and that promise, even though he never heard it aloud, was what held my world together for a long, long time after. Some things the body feels before the mind is ready to accept them. That's how it was with him. The silence in his cot, the way his fingers trembled even without the cold, his eyes fixed on a point that didn't exist. He knew. Before any words, before any announcement, Ji-hoon already knew his time was coming. Not death, not that one, but departure, removal, erasure. That morning something felt off. The radio hissed coded names. A new list had arrived. The kind of list that, once printed, left no room for appeal. Transferred patients, security movement, new triage, new separation. The orders came from too high up to question. But I knew, the moment I looked into his eyes, he was on it. No one had told us yet, but he was already preparing himself from the inside. As if his body had disarmed something his mind didn't want to see. And that look, oh, that look, it wasn't fear. It was goodbye. A goodbye that didn't need to be spoken, because it already lived in his eyes, in the slow blink of his lashes, in the stillness of his lips, as if even speech had given up the fight. I walked over slowly, sat beside him. He looked straight at me. No tears, no tremble. But there was a question, silent, desperate, suspended. Are you going to let me leave alone? I had no answer. I swallowed hard, tried to look composed. My throat burned like it was full of sand. My hands were sweating, and I did my best to seem calm. But inside, I was already breaking. Because for the first time since all of this began, I had no way to protect him. No rule to bend, no form to tweak, no sergeant to distract. The order came from too high, and his name, the one only I knew, was going to disappear. Not as a prisoner, not as a patient, but as a mistake to be corrected. A secret the army wanted to erase. He took my hand. Didn't squeeze, just touched. A small gesture, but the weight of it. It carried 1,000 unspoken words. And in his eyes I read it all. Gratitude, sadness, fear, and a kind of love that only surfaces when time is running out. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. If someone saw, they'd know. So I turned my head, pretended to write something. But my hands were shaking so much the pencil fell. He picked it up, handed it back to me, and smiled. A short, aching, resigned smile, the kind that says, "Thank you for seeing me," even when no one else did. And in that moment I understood. The deepest kind of love is the one that has to leave quietly. The kind that gets no farewell, no letter, no photo. Just the weight of a glance burned into your memory stronger than any word. His eyes, my God, his eyes in that moment are one of the few things that still visit me when the world goes quiet. He didn't cry, and neither did I. But something between us broke, not like glass shattering, but like old wood slowly cracking from within. And even though we didn't know what would come next, we knew this separation was the end of everything we'd known until then. Not the end of the feeling, but the end of the shelter, the end of the living secret, and the beginning of the silent grief only those who love in hiding ever know. His cot was taken not long after. No one told me. No one gave explanations. He was just gone. And with him, the only man who ever called me home. What haunts me the most, even now, is this. He never asked to be saved, never begged, never reached out in desperation. Ji-hoon accepted his fate with a stillness that hurt more than any scream. It was as if he already knew life didn't owe him anything. As if he was born to be a passerby, a shadow crossing lands where he was never meant to stay. And still, I wanted to save him, against everything, against everyone, against myself. Because there was something in him that pulled me out of what I was taught to be. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't pity. It was something older, deeper, an instinct, maybe ancestral, that said love, even in war, still had a place. And that sometimes, to love someone is to save them, even if they never ask. After he was taken, I walked through days with my heart in my hands, waiting for news, a sign, anything to tell me he was alive. But nothing came. No voice, no letter, not even a rumor. And that's how war wounds you, with silence. It doesn't scream. It erases. It hides. It dissolves what was real into a fog of uncertainty. I started asking myself if I'd done enough, if I should have acted sooner, if I should have run away with him, faked a breakdown, created a diversion, anything. But the truth is, he never asked me to, never looked at me like he expected a miracle. He looked at me like someone who already knew. The kind of love we had was too rare to last. And that's exactly what made it sacred. I thought about the other women at the camp, the nurses who cared for soldiers who never came back, the widows without wedding bands, the lovers who were never named, about how much love war buries before it even becomes a body. And I understood. Ji-hoon didn't need saving. He needed to be remembered, seen, honored, even if only by me, even if in silence. And that, I did. I still do. Every day. Sometimes I find myself tidying up the house like I'm expecting company. Like he might walk through that door any minute with that same calm gaze, saying little, but saying everything. Other times I hear noises out by the ranch, and my heart still jumps like it could be him. But it's not. It never is. Because that kind of love doesn't come back. It settles in a part of you no one else can reach. He never asked to be saved. And maybe that was the greatest act of love he gave me. Never asking for anything. Never pressing me to run, to lie, to betray. He just stayed, and then he left. Like a passing season you didn't realize you needed until it was gone. Like a song you never recorded, but somehow never forget. And even though I never said this to him, here it is. I would have done it all again, without being asked, without any promise. Because loving a man like Ji-hoon, on the wrong side of the war, in the most dangerous corner of tenderness, was the only right thing I did back then. You get used to seeing pain. Over time, the groans become part of the background. The smell of pus and blood turns into the perfume of routine. And morphine, morphine, was the only relief left between life and agony. I knew how to measure it precisely. I'd learned to recognize in each man's eyes the difference between enduring and surrendering. But that day, that last day, the final drop wasn't just medicine. It was a goodbye. Ji-hoon no longer had a fever. His body responded, but in a strange way, like it was staying awake out of sheer will. Or for me, his skin, once hot and wounded, now felt cold from the inside out. His eyes were sunken. But there was still something there, some thread of presence, a piece of him that didn't want to fade before seeing, one last time, the only place where he may have ever been loved without a uniform. The syringe was nearly empty. It was a small dose, just enough to ease the spasms, calm the breath. I knew it was the last one in our ward. No more would come during that shift. And in that moment, with my hands entwined in his, I knew I wasn't just delivering anesthesia. I was offering peace, a brief, quiet peace. Maybe the only thing I still had to give him. I injected it slowly. The liquid slipped in, and his muscles softened just a little. It wasn't sleep. It wasn't unconsciousness. It was a kind of peaceful surrender, a sacred moment. He looked at me, not with pain, not with fear, but with that look that would follow me through all the years to come. A look that said thank you and remember me in the same breath, as if words by then had lost their use, as if he was already more on the other side than here. Time stopped, truly stopped. Even the canvas of the tent didn't move. The world went silent around us as if it knew what was happening was too intimate to be interrupted. I rested my forehead against his. I felt the warmth still there. I felt my body shake. I felt like screaming, but I didn't. I just stayed there, eyes closed, holding on to time, trying to memorize every detail. The smell of his skin, the sound of his breath, the curve of his face, the crooked scar on his collarbone. Everything. I needed to keep all of it, because I knew, as if the universe whispered it to me, that this was the last look. He didn't die that night. He was taken the next day. But to me, that was when he began to disappear. Not as a body, but as a presence. The last drop of morphine took the pain, yes, but it also took a part of me. Because in that moment I was nurse, lover, shelter, and farewell, all at once, and none of those roles had a space in any report. When I finally stood up after what felt like hours by his cot, I realized my legs weren't working right, as if with that drop, I had been anesthetized too. Not in my body, but in my soul, and I was never fully whole again. Even now sometimes I catch the scent of alcohol and cotton in the wind, and I remember the needle going in slowly, his hand gripping mine, and those eyes telling me everything that could never be said. Because it was right there, on the edge between relief and the end, that our love said goodbye. Not with words, not with promises, but with the force of two souls that knew it would never happen again. His name wasn't anywhere, not on the clipboards, not on the evacuation maps, not in the triage reports. No one wanted to know. No one wanted to record it. He was just another number passing through our hands, then vanishing into the procedural silence of war. But to me, he had a name. And writing that name down might have been the most intimate and most dangerous act of that entire story. Ji-hoon. 3 soft syllables, heavy with identity, with roots, with everything they tried to erase in him. It took me days to be sure that's what he was whispering. But once I wrote it down. Not on any chart. That would have meant the end of him. I wrote it where no one else could see, inside the flap of my own shoe. One night I knelt on the cold infirmary floor, took off my left shoe, peeled back the fraying leather flap, and with a ballpoint pen wrote it there, tiny and careful, like I was stitching a secret into my body. Ji-hoon. That's where I hid the truth, in a place where my feet stepped every day, where my body, even without thinking, remembered him with every step. Writing his name was more than a symbolic act. It was resistance. Because in war, what isn't named is doomed to be forgotten. And I refused to forget. I refused to let him become a number, a statistic, anonymous dust in the past. That name, inked into the lining of my shoe, was my way of making sure he still existed somewhere, even if it was only inside me. I walked with that name for weeks, then months, then years. The shoe wore down, cracked at the seams, frayed at the heel. But I could never bring myself to throw it away. It was like tossing out the only proof that he was real. That we were real, beyond the noise, the fear, the silence. That there was love, a bond, a secret stitched with soul. Sometimes, back in the infirmary, I'd press my foot against the ground just to feel that word pressed into my body. It was almost like a prayer, a reminder, a vow, as if with every step I was saying, "You're still with me." And he was. He always was. Because when the world wants to erase a story, the only way to keep it alive is to hide it in the most intimate place you can find. Years later, when I came home, I placed the shoe in a box lined with blue fabric. It's the same box where I now keep other memories, captionless photographs, letters never sent, and a small piece of gauze stained with iodine that once covered his wound. Things no one else would understand. But to me, they are monuments. Because some war stories don't make it into books. Some emotional stories hide in the smallest gestures. And some secrets, we write them where no one will look. Not out of fear, but out of love, out of protection, out of faith. And every time I open that box, I smell something I can't quite name. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's absence. Or maybe it's just the sound of his name still echoing where no one could hear. A name never spoken aloud, but still alive inside my ribs. Inked with pen, tears, and courage. For a long time I thought this story belonged only to him. Only to Ji-hoon. The man without a uniform, without a country, without a voice. The secret I tucked away between bandages and silence. But over time, and through the long hush of the years, I came to understand it was never just about him. It was about me, too. About the woman I became when I had to love gently and lose with dignity. About the nurse who knew how to save bodies but didn't know how to stop her own heart from bleeding in silence. Loving Ji-hoon was like lighting a lantern in a minefield. I knew the risk. I knew that one wrong step could bring everything crashing down. But I stepped forward anyway. And in that crossing, I discovered parts of myself I didn't even know existed. It wasn't just passion. It was the courage to see another human through eyes the world never taught me to use. It was allowing myself to feel for someone everyone called the enemy. It was recognizing that, before any flag, we are all just flesh, fear, and fragile hope. The war story I lived will never be displayed at a ceremony, never etched into a monument. But it shaped my body, my memory, my voice. Not for what I did, but for what I refused to deny. And to love in that time was an act of resistance, because no one expected me to feel. No one expected a black woman from the deep south of Mississippi, with calloused hands and a disciplined heart, to carry in her chest a love that looked so wrong in the world's eyes. But I carried it, and I still do. Every glance I shared with him reminded me that beneath the uniforms, the languages, the military codes, we're all made of the same vulnerability. He didn't need to promise me anything. And still, he left a mark in me that time could never erase. It wasn't a fairy tale, love. There was no happy ending. There was absence. There were wounds. There was waiting that never got its answer. But there was truth. And sometimes, truth is enough. I had to hide that love from the world, but I couldn't hide it from myself. And maybe the biggest secret was what it revealed about me, because loving Ji-hoon taught me who I was when no one was watching, when there were no orders, no missions, no uniforms. Just a woman sitting beside a man, between dirty sheets and wounded hope, discovering that the purest love is the one no one gives you permission to feel. I never told this story seeking forgiveness or glory. I tell it because it still lives in me, and because somewhere there are other women carrying loves buried under fear. Loves that didn't fit into rules either. And maybe, if they hear me, they'll recognize themselves. Not to follow my path, but to understand that feeling was never the mistake. This love changed me, not just because it existed, but because it forced me to see myself with honesty. And today, even without knowing where he is, even without knowing if he's still breathing, if he grew old, if he remembers me, I live with the certainty that we were real. For a short time, for no time at all, for all time, and that no one can ever erase. Some secrets we carry like medals, others like scars. Mine, I carried like a silent cross, stitched between the folds of memory. I never asked to feel what I felt, but I could never forget either. And maybe forgetting would have been the cruelest kind of betrayal. I don't regret having loved. Maybe I regret staying silent for so long, letting the world decide what I was allowed to feel, and for whom. Because if war taught me anything, it's that there's no right side when it comes to love. There's only the human side. And that's exactly what they tried to erase in me. Today, at 85, I don't move with urgency anymore. The chair I sit in creaks slowly, as if it knows it's holding more than an old body. It's holding stories that were never allowed to be spoken. War stories, yes, but also tenderness, risky choices, feelings that were never granted permission. When the wind blows through the windows of my ranch here in Mississippi, it carries dust and memory. The curtains sway like they're waiting for someone to return. And I'm still here, with my dark skin marked by time, with eyes that still remember the shine in his, with bare feet on packed earth, feeling with each step the name I once wrote where no one else could see. Sometimes I think this wasn't just a story about forbidden love. It was a story about what remains when everything is taken from you, except your ability to feel. And maybe the most beautiful, the most real thing is this: what we feel when no one's watching, what we hold inside when the whole world tells us to let go. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to all of us who have loved in silence, who have cared without being seen, who have carried a name in our chest that couldn't be spoken out loud. And if somehow you saw yourself in me, then this story belongs to you too. Take a deep breath now. Close your eyes for a moment. And remember someone who's been tucked away quietly in your heart for far too long. Maybe you don't need to speak it out loud, but allow yourself to feel, because feeling is still what saves us. If this story touched any part of you, leave a comment below. Tell me if you've also carried a story inside you, even if it doesn't have a name. Subscribe to the channel. Stay close. This is a small corner for those who carry memories the world never wanted to hear. A safe place. A home. Even if just for a few minutes. And share this video with someone who might need the reminder that loving was never a mistake. My name is Naomi Joelle Franklin. I was a field nurse in the Korean War, and I loved a man the world told me I wasn't allowed to love. But he was real, and I still remember his true name.